The results of both projects, and I'm sorry to collapse them, but this is just a question of timing. The results of both projects suggest the complexity of the identifications and attachments between public services and the people who use them. Both projects show how the public is not just something out there that's waiting for somebody to talk to them. They are actually constituted in the way in which initiatives, whether they're participative or consumerist, are set up by agencies. And both projects also show how individuals and communities are being drawn in as partners and collaborators in the process of governing. However, both projects also show the possibility of new forms of claim making by individuals, by user movements, and by agencies speaking in the name of the consumer. Now, this dynamic about power and agency is important. It's about new governmental strategies, but also new strategies amongst the public and those who represent them to create spaces in which new voices can be heard. So I'm not assuming that subjects are necessarily subjected. Nevertheless, the increasing focus on service-specific, community or project-based patterns of public engagement offers a constrained and limited form of political imaginary, I want to argue, in which wider issues of equality or justice are displaced. And to illustrate this, I want to go back to the picture that was on your screen when you came in. I chose this, apart from the fact that it's called good governance, which is supposed to be my subject, because it depicts a hierarchical relationship between ruler and people. The ruler's up there, people are down here, and the only things that mediate that very vertical and hierarchical relationship is this figure on the left of your screen, which is holding the scales of justice. Right? Now, in modern times, we've seen a shift to a focus on more open and democratic relationships between government and people, based on liberal notions of citizenship inscribed in the nation state. And that offers a seemingly broader imaginary of belongingness, albeit one that's constrained by who is inside, who is outside, and who is marginal to the collective imaginaries of national citizenship. But I want to argue that's still a vertical relationship between government and people, albeit more democratic. How do the initiatives I've just talked about change this? I want to argue that the remaking of publics in participative, consumerist, and community locales recasts the public sphere into a series of horizontal spaces. They're interlinked, but they're horizontal. And the imaginary that goes with that is narrowed to the local, to specific services, or to specific communities. And this is a process that Wendy Lana talks about as a communitization of government. Now, community participation or responsive public services have to be viewed as positive rather than negative developments. But I want to look at what happens when that process is articulated with a second governmental strategy concerned with the remaking of publics. And that's the shift from public to social in governmental discourse, with a rise of an intense focus on questions of social capital, social inclusion, social investment, and so on. And this is a little snapshot of the words used by New Labour in their manifesto just prior to the last election. The size of the type indicates the frequency of the word count. Now, the privileging of opportunity and choice, I think, mean that the social is collapsed into the economic in a way that marginalises and residualises the public. Indeed, the public tends to be associated with an old-fashioned imagery of the welfare state, something that comes out clearly from a recent Demos pamphlet by Tessa Jowell, Secretary of State in the Department of whatever it is, Culture, Media and Sport. Thank you. And the pamphlet is actually about rebuilding the public realm, and it nevertheless is fixated on this community image as the way of doing that. But what I'm interested in here is that she goes on to describe the troubled fate of a number of public institutions, the BBC, public libraries and museums, and even the Open University gets a mention, all associated with historical notions of a collective public sphere. My last theme for this section on research, then, is how are public institutions transforming themselves to respond to new claims for recognition and representation. And this question brings me to a small piece of work that looks back to the period of public sector growth and shifts in an institution that stood as an icon of the public domain. You won't be surprised to know, the library service. And this is where nostalgia does come in, and here we are. Now, this is an image of me and some of the colleagues I worked with in the mid-70s in Birmingham's library service, several of whom are in the room. And you get an extra drink if you can pinpoint any of them. This was before I left local government to do a PhD. And not only do I want to pay tribute to the colleagues from that period who are here, but also, another bit of nostalgic, I want to recognise the contribution of Clive Newman, who's here, who supported me through that transition. Okay, so what to take from this picture? Well, apart from the fact that we're all so young, the gender balance is quite interesting, and of course, we are all white. And this was in Birmingham, in the inner city, in a period where, we were just coming up to the race disturbances in the early 1980s in Birmingham, and we were struggling to think about how to respond to the new multicultural city that we lived in. So let me take you back to this period when many of us who worked in public services were engaged in trying to change them, challenging paternalism, responding to the challenges of new social movements, and trying to incorporate community activist claims. Now, the service I joined in the 60s was just celebrating the shift from closed to open access, which I'll tell you about in a minute. And the buildings in the inner city looked like this. They were built as markers of civic pride, and the institutional iconography was really not helpful in reaching out to new publics. This is an image of a closed access library, and the city centre library was still like this. And you can just see the guys at the end who are there to take your request for the book that were going to then be served from way behind where the public could get it. And the shift to open access, and this is the image of modernity that was the libraries that I started working in, was really quite significant. This idea of open access was really quite significant, so significant that we named one of the professional journals Open Access. In the 70s, however, these ideas of openness were being challenged by a new sensibility of the limits of passive conceptions of open access in addressing sharpening inequalities. And two developments stand out. One was the turn to community, taking services outside a building. And secondly, the response to diversity, based predominantly on establishing special collections for particular groups of readers. So we set up teenage collections, women's collections, Black Studies collections, adult literacy collections. What else? Loads and loads of if you could think of a public, right, we made a special collection for them. And often quite successfully. In fact, the Birmingham Library is now known nationally for its reputation in services to gay and lesbian readers. So it wasn't all a failure. But it has to be said what we're doing. We were not political, right? Although I was just involved in the early release unit there. And we had no coherent theoretical base to what we were doing. Some of the group I was working with were graduate trainees. I was doing D100. So the question is, why did we do it? And I'm currently using interviews with key colleagues from the period, Viv Griffiths, Judith Elkin, Bob McKee, Jeff Mills, to go back to that foundational question about who is the public in a diverse society and what we thought we were doing in our attempts to reach out to new publics in a drive for equality and accessibility. And similar questions are key to a number of institutions, including this one.